Bread has a long history. It has for thousands of years been a staple of the human diet and is eaten in countless different forms and places. Therefore, it is interwoven with meaning and influences our daily lives. How does the Molen van Buursink reflect the changing Dutch relationships to grain and bread in an era of industrialized and outsourced food production? The basis of this food is grain. Over time, the use of grain has not changed much. Just as we did thousands of years ago, we use it to create bread and sustain our bodies. But the process of acquiring bread has changed. Where in our modern world the systems are mostly automated in factories in enormous quantities, there used to be mills to process local grains. But what does the process of grain to bread look like? First, very practically, it takes about 3 to 4 months for the grain to grow from a seed to be ready to be harvested. The harvested grain is then threshed and winnowed to separate the edible kernels from the husk. Those kernels are then transported to the place where they can be processed and ground into flour. Grinding alters the grain's physical structure and thereby transforms it from a natural material into potential foodstuff. It breaks the endosperm, germ, and bran. The flour is then sold and transported. The next stage is making the dough for the bread. By mixing flour with water, salt, and yeast, the biological process of fermentation is activated. Yeast consumes the sugars in the flour, releasing carbon dioxide that causes the dough to rise. Finally, baking subjects the dough to heat, solidifying its structure and making a bread. Up until now, we have looked at grain processing as an isolated process, almost separate from the world it inhabits, but there are many aspects that we miss in such an approach. Instead of looking at it entirely theoretical, Aparundi notes to look at it through a methodological point of view, as it is the things in motion that illuminate their human and social context. We tend to see materials as separate from ourselves, but it is most likely that all of us have consumed grain in the form of bread, cake, or pasta. As Annemarie Mol says in her book Eating in Theory, as an eater I do not first and foremost apprehend my surroundings, but become mixed up with them. We as humans are as much a part of the process and the value assigned to grain as the grain itself. Grain is historically ground by hand or in wind or water-powered mills. As Tim Ingold argues in his book, Making, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art, and Architecture, such acts of making are not simply technical operations, but forms of correspondence between humans and materials, where knowledge is embodied in practice and movement. As it comes to creating the dough and thus bread, Jane Bennett suggests in Vibrant Matter, matter itself becomes agentive. The dough is alive, responsive, and self-transforming. The resulting loaf embodies a fusion of nature, culture, and technology. Sunlight stored in grain, human labor and knowledge, and fire as a transformative force. As Arjun Aparundi would phrase it based on his book, The Social Life of Things, Commodities and Cultural Perspective, bread thus carries a social life. Its material changes are inseparable from the cultural meanings attached to nourishment, community, and everyday ritual. But what does this material mean, and what has it meant? Let's look at what the processing of this material has meant in general and for the surrounding village. We decided to gain empirical evidence by choosing to look at one specific mill and village to investigate what the processing of grain can mean. We looked at Molen van Buursink in Markelo. In 1835, the windmill De Hoop, was built as a grain and hulling mill. 60 years later, an oil-based motor was added as a power source. Another 30 years later, an electromotor was put into place. After that, the mill deteriorates and is eventually closed. In 1991, however, the mill was restored to serve as a monument and is still able to process grain to this day. It is also a staple to the community, as for example, the arrival of Sinterklaas, or Santa Claus, was celebrated there for the local children. As discussed in The Material World of Capitalism by Karl Wennerland, capitalism is based on an improvement ideology. There is a focus on constant technological improvement to better economic gains. We also see this in the mill. First the oil-based motor, then the electromotor. But these advancements actually led to the demise of the mill. Additionally, outsourcing, which is the act of obtaining resources from other companies and buying them instead of owning the entire production process, has led the mill to become redundant. Where the process used to be localized, the grain now comes from Germany or France and is processed in factories that can operate on an enormous scale. It was the cultural appreciation of grain, interest in its process, and the history that made the village reinstate it. The village itself has changed around the mill too. When it was built, it was on the outskirts of the village, with the farms easily accessible through the road. The village is still agricultural, but grain is no longer grown here. The farms around the village have become less important, and houses have been built where there used to be crops. The volunteers at the Molen van Buursink pointed out the animal feed factory that can be seen from the mill. This is where huge amounts of grains are now processed into animal feed. You can see the industrialization of grain processing. Even though the flour sold at the mill today is mostly not processed here, it is still a cultural carrier of memory. The small shop inside the mill sells different types of flours with historical and local recipes attached. The recipes have been acquired by asking locals, like the recipe for Twentse kruidkoek, which can only be sold here for it to be authentic. Not only is the mill a monument for the agricultural history of the village, but through its attention to the different types of grain, it is also a monument to grain itself. Different types of grain have been dried here, and visitors to the mill are educated on them. This makes them engage with the material that they consume every day in a different way. Mills create social cohesion and a sense of local agency. An article from 2009 by Frans Tisse, titled Social Capital in Rural Communities in the Netherlands, finds that strong local infrastructure contributes to social capital, cohesion, and quality of life. This includes shared facilities, traditions, and local practices. Mills historically served as central nodes of production within villages, including for grinding grain, baking, and local trade. The miller at Molen van Buursink explained that the mill also communicated to the surrounding people by changing the position of the wings. It could signal a joyous occasion like a birth or a wedding, or a sad one like a death. This central role means that mill acted as a social hub by facilitating interaction, shared reliance, trust, and local knowledge. Consequently, people built their homes closer to or around the mill, creating a literal village and community. The miller's work and the communal dependency on the mill helped structure village rhythms and relational networks, as well as the physical village itself. In summary, mills influence rural Dutch communities by anchoring material practices like grain milling and bread making in the local landscape by fostering social networks and shared rhythms around production and consumption. As industrialization and outsourcing shift production away from the village, the mill's role becomes less functional and more symbolic, but its influence on community cohesion, identity, and food culture remains significant.